Hello and welcome to the lecture on the integumentary system. This is chapter 5 in your textbook, so you'll definitely need to read and make sure you go along the notes. I'm going to skip a few slides today, and basically some of the things I'll be saying on some of those slides, but I like to use the pictures to talk about, but just remember that those slides are there. So the integumentary system is basically dealing with the skin. So we refer to the skin and its appendages as the integumentary system. And there are three major regions of your skin. We have the epidermis, the dermis, and the hypodermis. The hypodermis is actually below the skin. We don't consider it necessarily a part of the skin, but we do talk about it in regards to the skin, because if you'll recall from our terminology, hypo means below. Hyper means above or too much, and hypo means below or not enough. So the hypodermis is below the dermis. It is the deepest region of our skin. This particular region, just below the skin, consists mainly of adipose tissue. So this is where you find those fat deposits that are just under the skin. So mostly adipose tissue here. If you'll remember, that's a type of connective tissue. Now the epidermis and dermis are parts of the skin that we'll be looking at momentarily in a picture. The epidermis is your most superficial region, made of epithelial tissue. And the dermis is just below. It's a middle region that's much thicker. So this is basically a cross-section of your skin. And from this picture, this is a really good picture to study because you can see all those components of the skin that we'll be looking at. Now, first of all, I would like to point out a couple of things. This ridge here separates the epidermis from the dermis. Those little wavy areas, that's called the dermal papillae. That's actually what gives you your fingerprints. And remember, so everyone has unique fingerprints. Everybody on the face of the earth, no two people, even identical twins, do not have the same fingerprints, leading us to believe that the environment and location in which the twins are situated in utero helps determine how their fingerprints actually form. And there is research to back that up. So the dermal papillae, these wavy areas, actually separate the epidermis from the dermis. And that's epithelial tissue. Now, deep to the epidermis is the dermis. And it consists of the papillary layer and the reticular layer. So here's the papillary layer here. Here's the reticular layer here, which makes up about 80% of the dermis, the reticular layer does. So it's a much thicker area than the papillary layer. But important to remember, the dermis is broken up into those two areas, the papillary layer and the reticular layer. And then, of course, we can see very easily the hypodermis. How do we know that? Because we can see those deposits of fat called adipose tissue. So that's one of the markers that we know that we're looking at the hypodermis by seeing all the adipose tissue, those big fat round cells. Now, all the components that you can see in this picture, you're going to be responsible for understanding and knowing and being able to identify and locate. In a few minutes in the actual PowerPoint, we're going to look at actual glands, and you see some different glands in the picture. I'm going to go ahead and erase some of this other stuff so we can actually kind of not be bothered with all the complications of the other drawings I made. So there we go. And these are some different glands. You'll remember glands are lined with epithelial tissue, and they're involved in secretions. So our secretions come from those glands. So in a moment, we're going to actually categorize those glands and make sure we understand where to find them and what they do. Additionally, we have, you'll see there are nerves in the dermis, which helps us have sensation. And there's a good blood supply in the dermis. And if you'll recall, epithelial tissue, which we find up here in the epidermis, does not have a blood supply. And you can see how those vessels actually end right before they get into the epithelial tissue, because epithelial tissue is avascular. And that epithelial tissue can actually get its nutrients because it is able, its capabilities of diffusion make it to where what it needs can get there to a degree. Except for these very outer layers, those are dead cells. The actual outer layer of your skin is dead cells, because the further and further they get away from the nutrition, of course, the less that they're able to thrive. Also, we're going to have some special nerve structures that you'll see. And we are going to look at those momentarily. So we have the nerve fibers, which you can see coming up. We also have special structures called Pacinian corpuscles. And those are special little structures that allow us to sense vibrations. Have you ever felt a mosquito light on your skin? That's because of those little Pacinian corpuscles can pick that up. Additionally, your hair follicles, and so here's a hair follicle. Hair follicles have nerve supply go into them. So let's get rid of some of this on the picture. So here's our hair follicle. You can see the hair coming up through. Here's the follicle, and you see the nerves surrounding the hair follicle. And that is another way that we can sense touch to our skin, those little hairs. All right, so looking at the epidermis, we know that it's epithelial tissue. It's actually stratified squamous epithelial tissue, and it's keratinized. Keratin is a very special pigment that keeps us from drying out. It's the desiccation pigment. Keratinocytes make keratin, and it's very protective. It keeps our skin from allowing within to dry out. So that's a really important protein to have. And then we also have melanocytes in our epidermis. Melanocytes are extremely important as well. They're 10 to 25% of cells in your lower epidermis, and they produce a special pigment called melanin. Melanin is super important. It protects the DNA in our cells, and it's also what basically causes you to have skin color. So individuals who have darker skin typically have more melanocytes, making more melanin. And that's a good thing because it does protect the DNA in each cell. You'll also find cells called epidermal dendritic cells, aka Langerhans cells. These are macrophages floating around activating the immune system. So we like to think of those as the doctors of the epidermis. They're roaming around keeping up the health of the skin. We also have what we call tactile cells or Merkel cells that you can find. Those are work coordinating with the Pacinian corpuscles that I was showing you earlier, and they're touch receptors. So you'll find all those different types of cells in the epidermis. Now, the epidermis is separated into layers. And there's either 4 or 5 layers depending on where you are at the skin. And it's basically, if you're looking at the hands and the feet, the soles of the feet and the palms of your hand, you're going to have an extra layer. Everywhere else is just going to have the 4 layers. And you need to know these layers, 4 or 5 layers, and where you find them. There will be questions on your test asking you. So you'll want to be able to tell me those layers going from deep to superficial or superficial to deep, and the components of those layers. What do you find in those layers and what's going on? So make sure you know those layers, where you find them, and what's going on in each layer. Now the deepest layer found in all areas of the skin is the basement layer, aka basal layer. It is the deepest, and it's basically a single row of stem cells. If you'll remember, stem cells are the cells that make new cells. So the cells here are highly mitotic, rapid division going on here. This is another reason why those outer layers slough off. These cells are rapidly dividing, pushing subsequent layers out, further and further away from the nutrient supply. Another term we use to describe this layer is the stratum germinativum. Sometimes you'll hear that terminology, and that's because we think of those cells as germinating. They're undergoing mitosis, rapid division. So if you think about the basal layer, you can think of rapid mitosis, lots of cellular division going on here. And basically every 25 to 45 days you have all new layers of skin because of this rapid division. So the skin is always regenerating. The next layer is the stratum spinosum. We call it the prickly layer. That's just a little slang term for it. So right now we're describing from deep to superficial. We started with the basal layer, so the next layer out is going to be the stratum spinosum. It has pre-keratin filaments inside of it attached to desmosomes. Also, lots of melanin granules and dendritic cells in this layer. So this layer is a super important layer. And remember, keratin is going to prevent us from drying out, and melanin protects our DNA from UV radiation, such as the sun. Then the next layer out is called the stratum granulosum, or the granular layer. It just appears to be somewhat grainy. It's a thin layer, only 3 to 5 cell layers, and the cells are relatively flat, and it has keratin hyaline and lamulated granules, and that's what gives it that grainy appearance. Now, the next layer out is called the stratum lucidum. This is that layer I was telling you about. This layer is only found in the palms of your hands, the soles of your feet, and that's called thick skin. So thick skin is only found in the palms of your hands and the soles of your feet. You have thin skin everywhere else. And this is a few rows of flat, dead keratinocytes. And it's just an extra layer of protection for the hands and the feet, that's those areas that are highly abrasive. So you walk on your feet and you use your hands a lot, so it just helps to have that extra layer of skin making thick skin. All other skin is referred to as the thin skin. So you will need to be able to distinguish between thick and thin skin. And basically it's going to be the location and the fact that it has that stratum lucidum. The next layer out is the stratum corneum. This is the most outer layer, sometimes referred to jokingly the horny layer, because it's because of it, when you look at it and the shape of it. There's 20 to 30 rows of dead, flat, keratinized cells, that have become little membranous sacs. Those are dead. They're constantly sloughing off. Ever wondered why you have to dust your house constantly? It's because you're constantly sloughing off these cells. So the more humans you have in your house, the more dust you're going to have, and the more you're going to need to continue to dust. But it's mainly these cells that you're constantly sloughing off. So it's very thick. This is a thick layer. 3/4 of your epidermis is made up of this layer. And the function of this layer, being the most outer layer and the layer that is exposed to the environment, it protects from abrasion and penetration. It's a waterproofing layer. It's keratinized, so that as the keratin has pushed out, it is waterproofing, and it's a barrier against biological, chemical, and physical assaults on our body. So this is a very protective layer, this most outer layer known as the stratum corneum. Looking at this picture, this is the picture out of your text. You can see this picture in your textbook. It is actually located on page 153, and you can see the different layers. You can also see some of the cells we've talked about, the epidermal dendritic cell. You can see that kind of a spiny-looking cell right here. You can see these little granules. Remember looking at the grainy layers. So you can see that really good. Also, looking at the basal layer here, these cells are under active mitosis. Also, you can see one of those little Merkel cells here located in the dermis for sensory vibration and touch. So just make sure that you can identify those layers and name them, either deep to superficial or superficial to deep, however you're asked, and understand and know the components of those cells. Now let's move to the dermis. As you'll recall, we divided it into 2 layers, papillary and reticular. And if you want to refer back to your picture, on page 151 in your textbook, you can see what these two layers look like in the dermis. Recall the papillary layer is a very small layer. This is the layer in which you would find areolar connective tissue. Thinking back to your tissues, if you'll recall, we can identify areolar connective tissue because it has very visible fibers and all types of fibers. And you can see very easily the elastic fibers and the much thicker collagen fibers in this particular type of connective tissue. Also, you can see the blood vessels coming through. The branching of the blood vessels are at the papillary layer so that the epidermis can get its nutrients and supplies that it needs. Also in the papillary layer were the dermal papillae. If you'll recall, those were those little wavy regions, and it's basically the area that separates the dermis from the epidermis. In that particular areas where the little capillary loops you can see to get nutrition and supply to the epidermis. You also see Meissner corpuscles and free nerve endings right here in this area for touch and vibration. The reticular layer is the much thicker layer. 80% of the dermis is the reticular layer. Lots of collagen fibers here for strength and resiliency. Remember, when we think collagen fiber, we think high tensile strength. We also have elastic fibers for stretch and recoil properties, so stretchiness is important here. And thinking about the skin from its markings, the friction ridges where the epidermis, the ridges of the epidermis lie upon the papillary layer, making your fingerprints. This is also, if you have like a blister on your foot from a pair of shoes, typically this is what's happening is the epidermis is rubbing away from the dermis at this area right here, and that's why you'll have that abrasion. We also have cleavage lines in the skin. These are collagen fibers arranged in bundles that forms tension lines. You can see these in the skin, especially as we age. Now let's talk about skin color. Skin color is very important. There are three components of our bodies that make our skin change in color. And we've already talked about one, the pigment known as melanin produced by the melanocytes. This is what gives your skin the main color, yellow to reddish, brown, black, lots of different skin colors that we could see. And it all has to do with the concentration of melanocytes that we have. Some people make more melanin, some people make less. The melanocytes produce the melanin, they migrate to the keratinocytes to protect them. So they shield, melanin, that pigment shields the DNA of these keratinocytes. So it's very protective so that you don't get cancer. Remember, we need to lessen our exposure to the sun. Also, freckles and pigmented moles that you see in your body, that's usually where the melanin has accumulated. So that pigment accumulates and makes a mole or a freckle. Second thing, keratin. This can actually give you a yellow to orange hue, most obviously in the palms and the soles, palms of your hands, soles of your feet, and that's usually from nutrition. If you want to see the effects of keratin, eat lots of carrots. Keratin is found abundantly in carrots, and if you eat too many carrots, you can actually turn orange. This is true. I had a teacher in 7th grade, Miss Klepper, who loved carrots and ate them so much she turned orange and always had an orange glow about her. And the last contributor to skin color is hemoglobin, and that's whether or not it's oxygenated or deoxygenated. That's where you hear the old adage, someone turns blue if they don't have enough oxygen, and that is true. And that's because the hemoglobin, when it's carrying oxygen, has a different color than when it is not. If someone's fully oxygenated, they'd have a pinkish hue, and if they're deprived of oxygen, it'll be somewhat blue. All right, let's talk about what you can find in the skin. So we've talked about the actual skin, referring to the epidermis, dermis, and the hypodermis. So let's talk about the appendages of the skin. We have sweat glands, oil glands, hair and hair follicles, and nails. These are all derivatives of the epidermis. Very important parts of the skin as well. Now I told you we were going to distinguish between glands earlier. So you can refer back to that picture on page 151 where you can see a couple of examples of these glands, but we categorize glands into two main categories. They're either eccrine sweat glands, also known as merocrine, which you will have some test questions that you'll need to be able to distinguish, and you probably noticed in your lab assignment for Tissues Part 1, there was a little section on distinguishing between glands. These eccrine sweat glands, also known as merocrine, they are abundant on the palms of your hands, the soles of your feet, and your forehead. So these are sweaty areas from time to time because you break out in a sweat. There's a numerous amount of these eccrine sweat glands in these areas, and they're about 99% water, got some salt in there, vitamin C, some antibodies, dermacidin, and metabolic waste that you find in sweat. These ducts connect to pores, and they do function in thermoregulation. This is a way that your body can actually cool down. When you start sweating, it is an attempt for the body to cool down. So as water evaporates off the body, it is a cooling mechanism. And so you can see here is an eccrine sweat gland right here. And you can see a microscopic picture there of the cuboidal tissue surrounding those glands. Now let's talk about the other type of sweat gland, also known as apocrine sweat glands. These are ones you find in your armpits, the axillary region, and the anogenital region areas. So you can find those in the axillary region and around the genital area. And these actually secrete substances called sebum, and it consists of some sweat and fatty substances and proteins. Also, these types of glands usually connect to hair follicles, and they don't start functioning until puberty. The other thing to note, we do have some specialized apocrine glands. These glands in your ear canal that secrete earwax, those are a specialized apocrine gland, and they secrete a substance called cerumen, so we call them ceremonious glands. That cerumen is the earwax. And also the mammary glands. So milk production glands, those are categorized as a specialized apocrine gland. Your sebaceous oil glands, these are the glands, the oil glands, they secrete differently. These are very widely distributed. These mainly are those little oil glands that surround the hair follicle that we've been seeing. They become active at puberty also and secrete sebum. Now these secrete through holocrine secretion, meaning that the cell kind of ruptures to release the contents, and they have a bactericide in them, and they lubricate the hair and soften the hair and the skin. So make sure you can distinguish between these types of glands. And we can see this here. Here's a sebaceous gland surrounding the hair follicle. Also, you can see this microscopic picture here. So you can see this is that gland, and these cells actually rupture to release its contents around the hair. And here you can see the hair in the follicle. So why do you have hair? Well, it alerts the body to the presence of insects on the skin. It guards your scalp. The more hair you have, the more your scalp is guarded, especially from sunlight, also from physical trauma and heat loss. You have hair most everywhere on your body, except you don't have it on the palms of your hands, the soles of your feet. That's where we have thick skin, if you'll recall. Also, it's not found on the lips or the nipples, and certain portions of the external genitalia will be hair-free. It does have dead keratinized cells, so hair is actually dead, and it has keratin. This keratin is the reason why it's harder than the other skin, but it is more durable than soft keratin of the skin, so it's durable and hard. You also have melanin in your hair to give it color, and these colors can vary. And what happens when we get old and we turn gray, our hairs turn gray, melanin production ceases. So it doesn't make our entire lives. It kind of wears out. That process wears out, and we get gray hair and get bubbles in the shaft, and that gives you that gray-white appearance. Well, let's talk about the structure of the hair. Of course, it extends from the epidermal surface into the dermis. You saw it goes pretty deep into the dermis. It has a two-layered wall. It's an outer connective tissue root sheath. Inside, you saw the epithelial tissue. You could see that in the microscope picture. It has a bulb that expands deep into the dermis. There's a receptor and has a nerve supply. You saw that, the root hair plexus. So each individual hair has these nerve endings. And there's a special muscle called the erector pili muscle. It is smooth muscle, meaning we don't voluntarily control it, and that's the reason why your hair can stand on end for like goosebumps. So that's the erector pili muscle. You can't see it in this microscopic picture, but you can see the erector pili muscle right there. You need to be able to identify it. You can see it's right by here's that sebum gland. Here's the hair and the root here, and there's the bulb. So looking at that, you can see here's that hair. Remember, epithelial tissue. Here's the papillae of the hair. You can see here's the cuticle here. Hair has a cortex. Here's that connective tissue that we were talking about. So you can see all of those components of the hair, and we can actually see below, going into the hypodermis, the adipose tissue. You can see those fatty cells surrounding it. Types of hair that you have vellus, which is pale, fine body hair. That's why children and females have a finer hair than males. Terminal hair is coarse. Long hair of eyebrows, scalp, axillary, and pubic regions, that's a more coarse hair. And hair grows, basically, it grows for most of your life. There are resting phases. The growth phase varies 6 to 10 years in scalp, 3 to 4 months in eyebrows for hair to grow. Looking at the nail, this is another appendage of the epidermis. It's also important. You don't really have to know a lot about the structure of the nail. Just understand that it's an appendage of your skin. All right, so what is the skin for? What are the functions of the integumentary system? We've talked about them, but protection. 3 types of barriers. It's going to protect you from chemicals, pH secretions. Actually, the skin has an acid mantle. It's slightly acid to help with this. Retards bacterial activity because of that acid mantle. Physical and mechanical barriers. You have keratin and glycolipids. And also biological barriers. You've got, remember, the little macrophages floating around that are doctors of the integumentary system. Body temperature regulation is important. We talked about that. Sweat helps to reduce our body temperature, and then we also have sensation here, temperature, touch, and pain to protect us. Metabolic functions, this one's important. The skin produces vitamin D, which is very important for our bodies and for us to be able to absorb calcium. It is also a blood reservoir. About 5% of the body's blood is found here. And then last, excretion of nitrogenous waste. Remember that sweat excretes waste, salt, in the form of sweat, and that gets that out of our bodies. All right, last things to talk about are cancer and burns. This one's really important. I want you to make sure you understand and know about skin cancer. There are 3 types: basal cell, squamous cell, and melanoma. 80% of the cases that you find of skin cancer are going to be basal cell. It's a slow-growing cancer. Most of these cases are not lethal. Squamous cell carcinoma is the next most common, and it arises from the keratinocytes found in the stratum spinosum. It does grow rapidly, but is usually very susceptible to treatment. The last one is really bad, melanoma. It's the most deadly. It arises from your melanocytes, hence the name melanoma. These are highly metastatic, resistant to therapies, and this one it will kill very fast. It will actually metastasize into the body and travel to other organs. Not a good one to have. You'll see, remember the ABCDE rule? Basically, the ABCDE rule is this. If you find an area that looks questionable, here's how you're kind of knowing, hey, I need to get this checked out. And I recommend a mole check every year. Asymmetry. Are the 2 sides of the mole or area different from one another? B, border irregularity. That means the borders have indentations or are kind of strange. C is for color. Is the color different? Especially if it's a black. Melanomas are typically black or blue or purplish. D is for diameter. If the spot has grown much larger, that's not a good sign at all either. And then E is for evolution. Has it evolved? Has it changed over time? So pay close attention to any areas of your skin. Skin cancer can be a very lethal cancer. All right, last part are burns. Heat, electricity, radiation, and certain chemicals can cause tissue damage. Denature your proteins, cause cell death. This is known as a burn. The immediate threat of a burn is dehydration and electrolyte imbalance, leading to renal shutdown and circulatory shock. The first thing to do is distinguish between a first, second, and third degree burn. First degree is just epidermal, local redness, edema, and pain. Second degree is when you have blisters. So if you have a blister appear, that means you've actually penetrated into the dermis and you have blisters. Third degree burn means the entire thickness of the skin is damaged, and sometimes this is not painful till it starts to regenerate because you've burned up the nerve endings. These are typically gray, white, cherry red, or black, and a lot of times to fix this you have to have skin grafting. How do you know how critical burns are? If it's very critical if more than 25% of the body has second-degree burns, or if any more than 10% has third-degree burns, and the face, hands, and feet having third-degree burns are really critical. So this is how physicians assess you. That concludes our lecture for today on skin. If you need to, listen to it a couple of times, and have a great day, and good luck on your test.